this video, I'm going to cover 10 quick tips that will help you succeed on the MPRE. The first tip is to learn and memorize the rules before diving straight into practice questions. A very common mistake that students make is that when they start studying for the MPRE, they initially start with practice questions. And although this is great to expose you to what the MPRE is and what it's going to look like, the problem is if you start with practice questions, you're applying rules that you don't know. So instead of starting with the practice questions, start with your material, start with an outline. A benefit to this approach by starting with the outline is that rather than learning the rules piecemeal from random different practice questions, you can learn the rules in a more organized and cohesive way. So for instance, if you started memorizing with the first chapter and started looking at regulation of the legal profession, let's say, you can focus on all the rules that just deal with regulation of the legal profession, and you'll see how they fit together. You'll have an easier time remembering them, rather than just doing practice questions and learning bits and pieces of the various rules kind of all over the place. So by starting with the material, you're going to make it much easier on yourself to remember more of the rules. As you're looking at the material, be sure to focus on things like the key words that you'll notice in the rules and things like the words may and must, which are really important because they indicate when something is mandatory versus permissive. Also pay close attention to the rules where a client can give informed consent, and that could waive any potential issue. These are really important pieces that they like to frequently test on the MPRE that you should definitely be watching out for as you're learning and memorizing the rules. My second tip for the MPRE is to review the MPRE's keywords and phrases. The MPRE questions tend to use very similar calls of the question over and over and over. For instance, in the call of the question, you may see something like, is this lawyer subject to discipline? Or is this lawyer subject to litigation sanctions? Or is this lawyer subject to civil liability? And by looking at the keywords and phrases, you'll get a better idea of what those mean. The keywords and phrases explain things like subject to discipline and subject to litigation sanctions and subject to civil liability. So that way, as you're answering questions, you have a much clearer idea of what they're looking for when they ask you whether, for instance, a lawyer is subject to discipline. My third tip for the MPRE is to spend more time on the highly tested topics. JD Advising has a great MPRE one sheet that breaks down all of the topics that appear on the MPRE. And in addition to a breakdown of what topics you'll see, it also breaks down the percentage of questions that each topic will make up on the exam. So remember, on the MPRE, you'll have 50 scored questions. Now, some topics make up a larger percentage of those 50 scored questions than others. For instance, the subtopic on attorney-client confidentiality makes up 6 to 12% of your questions. That means you'll see 3 to 6 questions just from that chapter. The most highly tested topic on the MPRE is conflicts of interest. This makes up 12 to 18% of your 50 questions. So 6 to 9 questions just on that one chapter or one topic, conflicts of interest. That says that you need to make sure you feel really comfortable with that material because that's going to make up a significant portion of your points on the MPRE. You're going to get a lot more bang for your buck if you spend time on the highly tested topics because there's more points on the table. There's more points available from those topics. My fourth tip is to use real MPRE questions as you practice. The MPRE is written and administered by the NCBE, that's the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and the NCBE has released a number of previously used MPRE questions. So you can find these questions for purchase in a number of different places. The NCBE sells them directly, JD Advising sells them. You can find and use these real released MPRE questions as you're practicing and studying for the MPRE. Why should you be using real questions? Well, the real questions are going to be the most similar to the actual questions you end up seeing on the exam. They're written by the same people. The NCBE wrote the exam, the NCBE wrote these real release questions. So that means that the fact patterns are going to be similar in complexity and length. The rules that they test will be similar in difficulty. The way that they structure and ask the questions will be similar. So using these real release questions is going to best prepare you for exactly what you're likely going to see on the actual exam. My fifth tip is to answer practice questions slowly and methodically. So don't worry about timing yourself as you begin doing practice questions. Certainly, if timing is an issue for you and you struggle with finishing exams on time, you do want to incorporate some timed exams into your study. But as you get started, it's important to answer questions slowly and dissect the questions. That way you really understand what they're testing, how they're testing it, and you're going to become much more comfortable with the format and structure of the MPRE questions. So as you're answering these practice questions, think carefully about the fact pattern, what's going on. After you answer it, look back at the facts and take notice of which facts were red herrings, which facts you were supposed to be focusing on. Make sure you're looking at the wrong answer choices as well. Don't just answer it and move on, but make sure you look at the other ones and try to explain to yourself why the other answer choices are not the best answer choice. This is going to give you a really comprehensive overview of the information tested on the MPRE. My sixth tip is as you're answering practice questions in the fact pattern, focus on what the lawyer is doing. Remember, the MPRE is testing ethics of lawyers. So a lot of times they'll give you a fact pattern where there's someone who's not a lawyer doing something inappropriate. It could be a paralegal, it could be a client, it could be someone that the lawyer is working with, like let's say the lawyer is working with an accountant, and they give you information that that person has done something wrong or that seems suspicious. We're not testing what that person's actions, whether that person's actions are suspicious or not, or unethical. We need to focus on the lawyer. So as you're reading the fact patterns, look carefully for the lawyer's actions, mindsets, conduct, and ask yourself whether the lawyer's actions are inappropriate. My seventh tip is as you're answering practice questions, try to answer the question before looking at the answer choices. So when you're doing a practice question, you should read the fact pattern, read the call of the question, and then stop. If you're tempted to look at the answer choices, cover them up with your hand. And ask yourself, what is the answer to the call of the question? So almost act like it's a short answer question where you would have to write out the answer. If you're feeling in your gut what the outcome should be, like let's say the question is this lawyer subject to discipline? And you feel in your gut that the answer is yes. See if you can explain to yourself why the answer is yes. Once you come up with that gut reaction and the answer that you think you're looking for, then look at the answer choices, uncover them, and see if you can find that answer amongst the answer choices. This is going to help you from being tricked by the answer choices that sound really good, but aren't actually correct. If you pre-decide what answer you're looking for, those other distractor answer choices are not going to be as tempting as they would have been if you had just gone straight to the answer choices from the beginning. My eighth tip is to eliminate answer choices that incorrectly state the rule or contradict the facts. And this goes back to my very first point about memorizing the rules. The better you have the rules memorized, the easier it's going to be for you to look at incorrect answer choices and very quickly see that they're giving you a wrong statement of law. For instance, they may give you an answer choice that says this is okay as long as the client consents in writing. But it might be a scenario where the client can't consent in writing. And so if you know that rule really well, and you know that this is the type of thing that cannot be washed away with the client's consent, you can quickly eliminate that as a wrong answer choice because you know it's an incorrect statement of the law. My ninth tip is to avoid the answer choices that essentially say that the lawyer is not in trouble because the client didn't suffer any harm. These are sometimes called no harm, no foul answer choices, and they're typically wrong. They're pulling at your gut and your heartstrings, and they want you to conclude that because no one got hurt, the lawyer shouldn't be subject to discipline. And that's not always the case. A lot of times, the rules of professional conduct are in place and are enforceable, regardless of whether the client actually suffered any harm. So, for instance, if a lawyer mishandles a client's money, and at the end of the day, the client says, it's okay, don't worry about it, it'll all work itself out, and I'll get the money I'm entitled to. And the question says, is this lawyer subject to discipline? A wrong answer choice will say no, because the client eventually got his money anyway. Even though the client didn't suffer any harm, that's a rule where the lawyer is still subject to discipline, even though no harm occurred. So watch carefully for those no harm, no foul answer choices and don't pick them. They're usually wrong. My 10th tip is to not forget about the exceptions to the rules. Another trick that you'll see in the answer choices is that a misleading answer choice will state the general rule. And it sounds really tempting because you think you've identified the rule that they're testing and you found it in the answer choice and it looks pretty good, but there's an exception that applies. So before picking the answer choice that states the general rule, think to yourself carefully if there are any exceptions to that rule and whether any of those exceptions might apply here. So I hope you found these tips helpful, and I wish you all the best of luck on the MPRE.